The signal went out across 10,000 worlds. Every screen, every holographic display, every neural feed in the Vexary Empire flickered to life with the same image. The Imperial Grand Fleet, numbering 300,000 warships, hung in the cold darkness of space like a swarm of metal predators. Before them sat a single blue planet, spinning slowly in the light of its yellow star, Earth, the last stronghold of the human species. High Commander Vorath stood on the bridge of the flagship Eternal Dominion, his scaled face pulled into what passed for a smile among his kind. He had waited centuries for this moment. The Vexary had conquered 400 species across the galaxy. They had crushed empires that spanned entire star clusters. And now, after 18 years of brutal war, they had finally cornered the last of humanity. The broadcast was his idea. He wanted every citizen of the Empire to witness the end of the human plague. He wanted them to see what happened to species that dared resist Vexary rule. The cameras floated between the massive warships, capturing every angle of the fleet's terrible glory. On Earth, 7 billion humans watched the same broadcast. They saw the ships blotting out their stars. They saw the weapons charging with enough power to crack continents. They saw their doom approaching, and the Vexary expected them to despair. They did not know humans very well. In a bunker 3 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps, Admiral Sarah Chun stood before a wall of screens showing the enemy fleet. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and her weathered face showed no fear. Around her, dozens of officers worked at their stations with calm efficiency. They had prepared for this moment for 18 years. The war had begun when a Vexary scout fleet entered the Sol system and demanded humanity's immediate surrender. When the humans asked for time to consider, the Vexary destroyed the colony on Mars as a demonstration of their power. 40 million people died in the span of 3 hours. The humans did not surrender. Instead, they fought. At first, the galaxy laughed. The Vexary laughed loudest of all. Humanity had no interstellar warships, no planetary shields, no weapons that could scratch Vexary armor. They were primitives who had barely mastered fusion power. Their defeat was so certain that the Emperor himself set a date for his victory celebration. That celebration never happened. Humans could not match Vexary technology, so they changed the rules of the game. They developed weapons that no civilized species would ever use. They created strategies so insane that Vexary commanders could not predict them. They fought with a desperate creativity that the ancient empire had never encountered. The first Vexary invasion fleet was destroyed by nuclear weapons hidden inside asteroid mining ships. The second fleet was crippled when human hackers uploaded a virus into their systems using the Vexary's own communication signals. The third fleet was led into a trap in the rings of Saturn, where human fighters used the ice and rock as cover for a devastating ambush. Year after year, the Vexary sent more ships. Year after year, the humans found new ways to hurt them. The Empire lost more soldiers fighting humanity than they had lost in their previous 1,000 years of conquest combined. But the losses could not last forever. Earth's resources were limited. Their allies had abandoned them. One by one, the human colonies fell. Luna, Europa, Titan, the stations in the asteroid belt. Each defeat pushed humanity closer to extinction. Now only Earth remained. High Commander Vorath believed the war was over. He had assembled the largest fleet in Vexary history, enough firepower to sterilize 12 worlds. There was no strategy clever enough, no weapon devastating enough to stop what was coming. He gave the order to begin the bombardment. 10,000 warships fired simultaneously. Beams of purple energy lanced through the darkness toward Earth. The watching galaxy held its breath, waiting to see the human world burn. The beams struck something invisible 200,000 kilometers from Earth's surface. Space itself seemed to ripple and flash as the energy was absorbed and redirected. A shield, larger than any the Vexary had ever built, flickered into existence for just a moment before vanishing again. Varth's smile disappeared. He demanded an explanation from his science officers, but they had none to give. Such technology should not exist. The power requirements alone would drain a star. Then the counterattack began. Across the void of space, points of light began to appear. They emerged from behind moons, from within asteroid fields, from the shadowed craters of dead worlds. Human ships, hidden and waiting for 18 years. Not the crude vessels that humanity had fielded at the start of the war, but something new. Something terrible. Admiral Chun watched the display as her fleet revealed itself. 3,000 ships, each one built in secret, deep beneath the surfaces of moons and planets across the solar system. 3,000 ships carrying weapons that humanity had prayed they would never need to use. The Vexari had wondered why the humans stopped building warships after the fall of Titan. They assumed it was despair, the acceptance of inevitable defeat. They never considered that humanity might be working on something else entirely. The human ships opened fire. Beams of white light, blindingly bright even through filtered cameras, cut through the Vexari formation. Where they touched, ships simply ceased to exist. Not exploded, not damaged, erased. The matter of their hulls converted directly into energy, adding to the destruction that spread outward in waves of annihilation. Voreth screamed orders at his fleet. The Vegari ships began to return fire, but their weapons splashed harmlessly against the shields of the human vessels. These were not the desperate refugees that the Empire had been hunting. These were predators finally showing their true nature. On 10,000 worlds, Vexari citizens watched in horror as the greatest fleet ever assembled began to die. The cameras continued to broadcast, too far from the fighting to be destroyed. They captured every moment of the slaughter. The human ships moved with perfect coordination, flowing around the Vexari formation like water around stone. They concentrated their fire on the largest vessels first, eliminating the carriers and dreadnoughts that formed the backbone of the fleet. Without command and support, the smaller ships fell into chaos. Admiral Chun directed the battle from her bunker, her voice calm as she issued orders. She felt no joy in the destruction. These weapons, this technology, had cost humanity everything. They had strip-mined their own moons to build it. They had sacrificed entire generations to develop it. The knowledge of what these weapons could do haunted her dreams. But humans did what was necessary to survive. High Commander Voreth watched his fleet crumble around him. Ships he had commanded for centuries vanished in flashes of light. Officers he had known since childhood screamed as their vessels were torn apart. The Eternal Dominion shuddered as smaller craft crashed into its shields, destroyed too quickly to change course. He could not understand what he was seeing. The Vexari were the masters of the galaxy. They had never known defeat on this scale. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. The human flagship, the carrier called Remember Mars, moved through the center of the battle. It was smaller than the Vexari dreadnoughts, but it radiated a presence that made enemy ships turn and flee. On its hull, painted in letters visible from space, were the names of every human colony that the Vexari had destroyed. 47 names, each one representing millions of dead. Admiral Chun gave the order to target the enemy flagship. Vareth felt the Eternal Dominion shudder as the first beam struck. His shields, the most powerful in the Empire, lasted 4 seconds. The second beam tore through the outer hull like paper. The third beam cut the ship in half. In his final moment, High Commander Voreth understood the terrible truth. The humans had not been fighting to win. They had been fighting to survive long enough. Every battle, every defeat, every retreat had been buying time for this moment. The entire war had been a distraction while humanity built its true weapons in secret. The Vexari had never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice so much for so long. They could not comprehend minds that would endure 18 years of horror just for a chance at revenge. It was a concept alien to their nature. That was why they lost. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the greatest fleet in galactic history had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Of 300,000 Vessery warships, fewer than 600 survived to flee into hyperspace. They carried news of the disaster back to their empire. On 10,000 worlds, the broadcast finally ended. The Vessery citizens had watched every moment of their fleet's destruction. They had seen the impossible become real. They had witnessed the moment their empire began to fall. Admiral Chun stood alone in her command center after the battle ended. The screens around her showed the wreckage of the enemy fleet and the distant blue glow of Earth still spinning peacefully. 7 billion people were celebrating their survival, dancing in the streets of cities that had been preparing for death. She did not celebrate. The weapons they had used were too terrible for celebration. The shields that protected Earth drew power from a source that would take generations to stabilize. The cost of victory had been paid in secrets that would change the galaxy forever, but humanity had survived. In the months that followed, the Vessery Empire cracked along fault lines that had existed for millennia. Subject species rose in rebellion, inspired by the broadcast of the human victory. The empire that had ruled for 10,000 years began its long collapse. Earth became a legend. The species that had stood alone against the masters of the galaxy, that had endured 18 years of losses that would have broken any other race, that had turned certain defeat into absolute victory. Other species began to send ambassadors, seeking alliances, seeking protection, seeking to understand how such a primitive world had achieved the impossible. Admiral Chun retired to a small house on the coast of what had once been Japan. She spent her days watching the ocean and remembering the people who had not lived to see the end of the war. The names on the hull of Remember Mars were never erased. They remained as a reminder of what had been lost and what had been protected. The broadcast of humanity's supposed defeat became the most watched recording in galactic history. Every species that had ever feared the Vessery watched it, again and again. They watched the moment when the human fleet appeared from hiding. They watched the moment when the tide turned. They watched the moment when the galaxy changed forever. The Vessery had wanted the universe to witness humanity's end. Instead, they had broadcast their own destruction to every corner of known space. It was the last lesson they would ever teach. Humanity had learned it well.